With the ever-growing popularity of shows like RuPaul's Drag Race and community participation in Pride demonstrations, it's become undeniable that there's an increasing interest in people exploring their sexuality and gender. Well, awesome! Fantastic! Unfortunately, there are a lot of assholes in the world trying to stop people from exploring who they really are. So, let's take a close look at what's going on here psychologically. Since this is such a huge subject with many factors to consider, in this video we're just going to consider cross-dressing. Now, cross-dressing can be defined as wearing clothing, makeup, or other items that society has labeled as belonging to the opposite sex. This labeling is, of course, completely arbitrary. Hyperion Susan Mitchell said, "Why do we even need to have men's clothing and women's clothing? How about just clothing?" She's absolutely right. There's no law written in the fabric of the universe that says if you have a vagina, you must wear a dress, and if you have a penis, you must wear pants. That's crazy. It's simply a product of the conditioning of the society that you were born in. A completely different society could have the exact opposite associations. For example, in ancient Egypt, it was perfectly acceptable for men to wear makeup. Black and emerald eyeshadow were popular choices. So if the customs change from society to society, how come so many people are drawn towards wearing clothing that a particular social institution has labeled as belonging to the opposite sex? Why do people feel inclined to break these social norms? Of course, there can be a variety of reasons dependent on the person and their situation, but let's take a look at a few very general cases. Let's say that you're a very young boy and you want to wear a dress because why the hell not? There's no reason not to, maybe you just like the color. Well, guess what? As soon as you put it on, you're going to get reprimanded by your parents and told, "That's not what boys wear, that's only for girls." Anytime you do something that society has deemed as belonging to the gender opposite of yours, you're going to get reprimanded by your parents, laughed at by your friends, and ostracized by society. So what happens? When you're a young child, all you understand is that certain actions are causing a negative stimulus, an emotionally painful response. And so to avoid the negative response of punishment or ridicule, you're going to stop wearing the dresses and playing with the makeup. However, your desire to do these things doesn't just go away. What happens is that they get repressed into your unconscious. These desires don't disappear, no matter how much you try to make them disappear. To understand this better, think of a time that you were about to tell your friend something, but you forgot what it was. It was on the tip of your tongue. You just had it a second ago, but now try as hard as you can, you just can't remember. What you were going to say, it didn't just disappear. It became unconscious. That piece of unconscious content can reemerge later and become conscious again. And then you'll suddenly remember what it was that you were going to say an hour later. Note that some people define that level as preconscious or subconscious, but that's really beside the point. Imagine an ocean. All your conscious content is above the surface of the water, while everything below the water is unconscious, and the deeper you go, the more embedded the content. The psychologist Carl Jung called the deepest and darkest part of your psyche the shadow. All your repressed desires don't go away, they remain deep within your mind. Deep within your shadow. They're as strong as ever, and it's very likely they've grown in strength without you ever knowing. Now, with regard to gender, since the current social institutions reprimand individuals for trying to explore these elements of themselves, it's actually creating repressed shadow content. In other words, when society yells at you for wearing a dress, it's creating within you an even deeper desire to wear a dress that will emerge later in your life. By making something off limits, it simply unconsciously makes you desire it all the more. Ignoring your shadow can be incredibly unhealthy. The goal is not to ignore your shadow, but to recognize it, embrace it, make it conscious, and explore it. The great philosopher Hegel recognized that the universe, all of reality, is an evolving mind coming to know itself through itself. It's a mind that seeks unification, wholeness, and completeness by unifying subject and object. You are a center of consciousness. You are a subjectivity. But from your perspective, everything else is an object. Yet, to other subjectivities, you yourself are an object from their subjective perspective. You have an object of your desire, and whether you know it or not, you seek unification with that which is other to you. Now, this can manifest itself as love and even as lust, where you desire sex and an intimate connection. And it can also manifest itself through literally altering yourself to become one with what you desire by donning the clothing of what has been deemed as other. In other words, the desire for all reality, for the universe, to unify subject and object, can manifest itself through some individuals as desire for the opposite sex, whereas in others, it can manifest itself as desire to be the opposite sex, or of course, in some cases, both simultaneously. Now keep in mind, this doesn't mean that it only applies to members of the sex opposite to each other. Those that are in same-sex relationships are also unconsciously seeking to resolve the apparent contradiction of subject and object. In other words, all reality, the universe, as expressed through us, because we are all reality, the universe, is seeking unification. We're always striving for wholeness and completeness. Now, another very important aspect to remember is that we are not our bodies. Our bodies are just avatars. What we truly are eternal, immaterial minds that simply link to bodies. And the mind has no fixed gender. So not only have we been born into a society that places restrictive and harmful gender roles on us, attempting to limit our exploration of ourselves and each other, but we've also been born into bodies that more or less have a fixed sex. But even though minds have no fixed gender, some minds prefer to express themselves as a specific gender, such as male, for example. Now, if this mind happens to feel more comfortable as male, but it links to a female avatar, this can be extremely frustrating. Bodily avatars are extremely limiting. Now, some minds prefer to express themselves as both, or even none at all. In the future, as evolution and technology advances, we'll be able to change sexes and body types as easily as we change clothing, provided, of course, that we erase the sick control systems put in place by the rich elite old worlders that want to keep you from exploring yourself. Consider this: if I were wearing a dress right now, by the majority of the world, I'd be instantly ridiculed, and hardly anyone would take what I have to say seriously. I'm already constantly the target of ridicule and ad hominem attacks simply because I have long hair and wear eyeliner. Now, if a woman wore a button-up shirt and a blazer, some people, some men at least, might find it a little out of the ordinary, but if anything, some of them would pay them even more attention to what she had to say. Now, don't you find that a little odd? Have you ever thought about why that is? This is because this world's sick patriarchal system sees men as higher than women. And when a woman wears clothing closer in style to a man's, as long as it isn't too extreme, of course, she is seen as more credible because unconsciously she is seen as having raised her status in society. Yet when a man wears a dress, he's instantly ridiculed. This is because since women are given a lower position, unconsciously, the man is seen as having lowered his status when he wears the dress. He's seen as less than a man. This is fucking sick and shows that when we fight for women's equality and equality for all, it goes much further than having to do with wage and things of that nature, but having to do with how people are viewed psychologically. You can see this everywhere when the female gender is used as an insult and the male gender is used in an empowering sense. For example, they'll say, "Don't be such a girl, don't be a pussy." Whereas they'll often say, "It's time to man up. Why don't you be a man?" It's time to stop perpetuating this psychological bias that women are less than men. Even if there were to be a so-called equality enforced by law, as long as society is churning out its sick propaganda and conditioning, women will be looked at as lower than men. And this is clearly illustrated when it's perceived as humiliating for a man to wear women's clothing. Now, don't get me wrong, if a woman goes too far when it comes to looking like the opposite sex, she will also be ridiculed because now she's moved too far from her subjugated role as a pretty object for men. This kind of mindset is sick, primitive. It's a disgrace. It doesn't have to be this way. This is all because the ruling elites have set up sick conditioning institutions that brainwash the masses to adhere to old, harmful, traditional ideals. And this is especially accomplished through the Abrahamic religions of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, which places women below men. 1 Timothy 2:12 says, "I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She must be silent." And Ephesians 5:24 says, "Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything." On the topic of exploring gender, the Bible says in Deuteronomy 22:5, "A woman must not wear men's clothing, nor a man wear women's clothing. For the Lord your God detests anyone who does this." The Bible also says that homosexuals are to be put to death, but that's a story for another video. Anyone that thinks that these religions are liberating in any way are either deranged or they've never actually read the so-called holy books. If you're for women's liberation, you cannot also support these sick Abrahamic religions. The two are incompatible. Now, if you support equality for all, stop supporting these awful religions that support inequality. Carl Jung said of the shadow, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it's embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." It's crucial to understand how important it is to confront and explore your shadow. Remember, that's where all your unconscious urges have been repressed. And these urges, they don't go away. They get deeper and darker. And this can cause you to engage in shadow projection. Shadow projection is when you know on an unconscious level that you have these urges, but you hate them so much that you will begin to hate anyone that expresses these qualities. For example, if someone has repressed their urge to wear women's clothing, then they can begin to hate anyone that does so. They see a cross-dresser, and that unconsciously reminds them of their own repressed urge, and so they ridicule or seek to eliminate the other person to further distance themselves from their own unconscious urges. In other words, the person that hates cross-dressers the most is very likely to hate them so much because he sees his reflection in them. They unconsciously remind him of his own hidden urges. This is extremely dangerous and leads to war and mass murder. Look at the total repression of the Abrahamic religions. They demonize exploration and sex as being sinful. Thus, it results in immense shadow repression of its followers. This resulted in the Dark Ages, where multitudes of pagans were slaughtered and burned alive for being heretics. The religious had so much shadow content that they killed anyone and everyone that they deemed as sinful. They hated sin so much because of their own unconscious desires to engage in what their sick, repressive religion labeled as sin. They project what they hate onto others and then seek to eliminate the other because they can't stand that it exists within themselves. This is why exploring your unconscious is so important, and why Hyperions support a healthy embrace of the shadow self. This is why we promote sin for salvation and why we say fuck for freedom. This world would be a completely different place if, instead of religious repression, it engaged in healthy exploration. It's time to end the sick institutions that create these arbitrary gender restrictions and keep people from exploring who they are and feeling happy with themselves. Guys, why don't you be man enough to go put on a dress? Gender restrictions are bullshit. You only don't because you're fearful. You'll learn a lot about women, society, and yourself. It's time to create a new world where all these damaging institutions, brainwashing religions, and controlling elites are abolished. A world in which everyone feels free to explore and express themselves in any way that they so will. That's the Hyperion world. We're all yearning to become whole and fully expressed. When it comes down to it, we're not male, we're not female, we're people. People free to express themselves as any gender they like, regardless of what kind of body they were born into. Life is expression, life is art, life is exploration. Isn't it time that you started really living instead of living in fear? My name is Morgue, and you're witnessing the dawn of the Hyperion Age. Ad Astra, to the stars. Make sure that you like and subscribe, and check out my Patreon for hidden videos.
Entering yourself, if you're for the freedom of thought, freedom of the individual, freedom of the whole, and if you're about embracing your whole self, about embracing your dark self and your light self, unifying shadow and light to become whole.
If you enjoy my videos, join us on Patreon. That's how I'm able to continue my work, and I'd like to give a big thank you to everyone on Patreon. I wouldn't be able to do this without you, and it means the world to me, my friends.